In the pre-dawn hours of what seemed like just another winter morning at Toronto Pearson International Airport, Captain Sarah Chen stood in the cockpit of Delta Flight 2847, performing her pre-flight checks with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined her 15-year career. What she didn't know then was that these routine moments would be the last normal ones before everything changed. The weather reports showed heavy snowfall, but nothing unusual for Toronto in February. The de-icing crews had already begun their work, their powerful sprays coating the aircraft's wings in a protective barrier against the frigid conditions. Sarah's fingers moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, each switch and dial as familiar to her as her own reflection in the cockpit window. First Officer Michael Rivera joined her in the cockpit, bringing with him 2 cups of coffee, a small tradition they'd maintained since their first flight together 3 years ago. "Looks like we've got a full house today, Cap," he said, settling into his seat. Sarah nodded, taking a sip of the coffee, grateful for its warmth against the morning chill that seemed to seep through the airport's walls. Through the cockpit window, they could see passengers beginning to board, their breath visible in the cold air as they hurried up the jet bridge. Business travelers in their suits, families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, each one trusting their lives to this crew without a second thought. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility, as she did every flight, but it was a weight she carried with pride. The cabin crew began their preparations, led by Chief Flight Attendant Jessica Parker, whose voice carried through the cabin with a warmth that put nervous passengers at ease. "It's amazing how she does that," Sarah thought to herself, listening to Jessica's gentle instructions to a young mother struggling with her baby's car seat. As the last passengers settled in, Sarah began her communication with the ground crew. The familiar radio crackle filled the cockpit as she received clearance for pushback. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should, exactly as it had thousands of times before. The engines hummed to life, their powerful vibration a comfort to those who understood their song. "Delta 2847, you're cleared for pushback." The ground controller's voice came through clear and professional. Sarah acknowledged, and the aircraft began its slow reverse from the gate. The snow was falling harder now, creating a peaceful scene through the cockpit windows, the airport lights refracting through the crystalline flakes. The taxi to the runway was smooth, despite the weather conditions. Sarah and Michael performed their final checks, their movements synchronized after years of working together. The passenger cabin had fallen into that peculiar quiet that always preceded takeoff, a mixture of anticipation and trust in the crew that would carry them safely to their destination. "Delta 2847, cleared for takeoff, runway 24R. The tower controller's voice broke through the silence. Sarah's response was automatic, professional. "Delta 2847, cleared for takeoff, runway 24R. As they began their takeoff roll, the powerful engines accelerated the aircraft down the snow-dusted runway. Sarah felt the familiar pressure in her back as the speed built, watching the indicators climb steadily. Everything was perfect, textbook perfect, the kind of takeoff that instructors would use as an example. V1, rotate. The nose lifted smoothly into the air, and the ground fell away beneath them as they climbed into the gray Toronto sky. The landing gear retracted with a gentle thud, and the aircraft continued its ascent through the snow-filled clouds. "Positive rate," Michael called out. "Gear up," Sarah responded, following the procedure that was as natural as breathing. The passengers would have felt that moment of weightlessness, that magical transition from earth to sky that never ceased to amaze, no matter how many times you experienced it. Some would be looking out their windows at the shrinking city below, others already closing their eyes for a morning nap, confident in the routine nature of their journey. If only they knew what the next hour would bring. The aircraft climbed steadily through 3,000 feet, then 5,000, breaking through the low cloud layer into clearer air above. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the clouds in shades of pink and gold, a beautiful sight that Sarah never tired of seeing. This was why she had become a pilot. These moments of pure beauty, of mastery over the elements, of carrying precious human cargo safely through the sky. But as they passed through 10,000 feet, Sarah noticed something small, something that might have been nothing at all. just a slight irregularity in one of the engine readings, the kind of thing that most passengers would never notice, that even some pilots might dismiss as a minor fluctuation. Sarah Chen, however, had not become one of Delta's most respected captains by ignoring her instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling her that something wasn't quite right. She glanced at Michael, who was focused on his own instruments, not yet aware that their routine morning flight was about to become anything but routine. In these last moments of normalcy, Sarah took a deep breath, her hand steady on the controls, her mind already racing through procedures and possibilities. The lives of 216 passengers and crew members rested in her hands, and what she did next would determine whether this flight would become a tragedy or a triumph of human skill and courage. The snow continued to fall outside, beautiful and serene, as the first warning light began to blink. The first indication that something was wrong came as a subtle vibration, different from the normal rhythm of flight that Sarah had internalized over thousands of hours in the cockpit. It was accompanied by an unusual reading on the Engine Indicating and Crew Alerting System, EICAS, showing a slight but concerning fluctuation in the left engine's temperature. "Mike, are you seeing this?" Sarah asked, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the growing concern in her mind. First Officer Rivera leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the readings. The vibration intensified slightly, and now there was no question. Something was definitely not right. The aircraft had just leveled at 22,000 feet when the first warning light illuminated. A soft but insistent chime filled the cockpit, drawing both pilots' attention to the master warning display. The left engine's readings were becoming increasingly erratic, and the temperature was climbing beyond normal parameters. "Toronto Center, Delta 2847, Sarah called over the radio, her voice steady and clear. "We're showing some unusual engine readings, requesting block altitude between flight level 200 and 240 while we investigate." The controller's response was immediate, professional, clearing the airspace around them as Sarah and Michael began working through their emergency checklist. The vibration grew stronger, and now some of the passengers would surely be feeling it too. Sarah could picture them in their seats, some gripping their armrests a little tighter, others looking around for reassurance. In the cabin, she knew Jessica and her crew would be maintaining their composed demeanor, keeping the passengers calm through their own example. Michael read through the checklist methodically, his voice clear and focused. "Engine anti-ice?" "On," Sarah confirmed. "Bleed air systems? Checked and normal. Engine power setting? Reducing to 70%. The reduction in power seemed to stabilize the readings momentarily, but Sarah knew better than to feel relieved. 15 years of experience had taught her that mechanical issues rarely resolved themselves at 22,000 feet. The snow was still falling heavily outside, creating an additional layer of complexity to their situation. "Delta 2847, Toronto Center." The controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "We're showing some unusual variations in your speed and altitude. Do you need any assistance?" Sarah could hear the underlying question in his voice. Did they need to declare an emergency? Before she could respond, a new warning light illuminated, accompanied by a more urgent chime. The left engine's temperature was now climbing rapidly, and the vibration had taken on a distinctive rhythm that every pilot dreaded, the telltale signal of mechanical failure. "Toronto Center, Delta 2847, Sarah replied, her voice now taking on the clipped, precise tone of a pilot dealing with a serious situation. "We are experiencing significant engine problems. Request immediate vectors for return to field." She paused for a fraction of a second before adding, "And yes, we need to declare an emergency." The words hung in the air for a moment, changing everything. The declaration of an emergency was never taken lightly. It set in motion a complex chain of events on the ground, mobilizing emergency services and clearing the airspace for priority handling. In the cabin, the interphone chimed. It was Jessica, her voice professional but concerned. "Flight deck, cabin. We're getting some questions from passengers about the vibration. How would you like us to proceed?" Sarah pressed the interphone button. "Tell them we're experiencing some mechanical issues and we'll be returning to Toronto as a precaution. Prepare the cabin for landing, but keep it routine for now." She knew the importance of managing passenger anxiety while preparing for any possibility. The left engine's readings continued to deteriorate. The vibration was now unmistakable throughout the aircraft, and Sarah could feel the subtle changes in handling as the engine's performance declined. She and Michael worked seamlessly together, managing the failing system while preparing for their return to Toronto. Delta 2847, Toronto Center, turn left heading 280, descend and maintain 15,000. You're cleared direct to Pearson when able. Emergency services are being notified. The controller's voice was calm, but carried the urgency of the situation. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began the turn back toward Toronto. Through the cockpit window, she could see the city in the distance, barely visible through the heavy snow. The weather that had seemed merely challenging during takeoff now loomed as a serious complication for their emergency return. As they began their descent, the left engine's parameters continued to worsen. Warning lights multiplied across the panel, their urgent illumination reflecting off the snow-filled sky outside. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, her mind already running through scenarios and procedures, calculating fuel weights and approach speeds with the reduced power available. Michael maintained constant communication with Toronto Center, updating them on their situation while monitoring the failing engine's readings. The coordination between cockpit and ground was flawless. Years of training converting a potential catastrophe into a well-managed emergency. But as they descended through 18,000 feet, a new sound cut through the cockpit, a deep, grinding noise from the left engine that made both pilots' hearts skip a beat. The vibration intensified sharply, and multiple warning lights began flashing simultaneously. Sarah knew that the next few minutes would test everything she had learned in her career. The lives of everyone on board now depended on her ability to manage this failing engine, handle the deteriorating weather, and get them safely back on the ground. Through the swirling snow ahead, Toronto Pearson Airport waited, its runways obscured by the strengthening storm. The real challenge was just beginning. Left engine fire warning. Michael's voice cut through the tension in the cockpit as a new alarm blared, its harsh tone demanding immediate action. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to the fire handle, her mind racing through the engine fire checklist she had practiced countless times in simulators, but hoped never to use in real life. Engine fire checklist, Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the weight of authority that had earned her the respect of crews throughout her career. Left engine fuel control, cut off. The confirmation came immediately from Michael as he moved the fuel control lever to the shutoff position. The decision to shut down an engine was one of the most critical a pilot could make, but with flames now potentially threatening the aircraft's structure, there was no choice. The grinding noise from the left engine ceased as the fuel flow was cut, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to emphasize the severity of their situation. Engine fire bottle 1, discharge, Sarah ordered, and Michael pulled the handle that would release the first canister of fire suppressant into the failing engine. Through the cockpit window, they could see the snow swirling more violently now, the visibility deteriorating with each passing minute. Toronto Center, Delta 2847, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Left engine has been shut down due to fire indication. Request immediate vectors for the ILS approach to runway 23. The response came quickly, clearing all other traffic from their path. In the passenger cabin, the sudden silence from the left engine had not gone unnoticed. Sarah could picture the scene behind her. Nervous glances between strangers, white-knuckled grips on armrests, flight attendants moving with practiced calm to secure the cabin. She knew it was time to address the passengers directly. "Flight attendants, take your seats," she ordered through the interphone before switching to the public address system. Her voice carried the perfect blend of authority and reassurance as she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Chen. We've experienced a mechanical issue with our left engine and have shut it down as a precaution. We're returning to Toronto and will be landing in approximately 15 minutes. Our flight attendants will now review our emergency procedures." The words were carefully chosen, honest about the situation without causing panic, preparing the passengers while maintaining calm. But the reality in the cockpit was far more complex. Flying on a single engine was challenging enough. Doing so in heavy snow with deteriorating visibility would test the limits of their skill and training. "Flight level 120, Michael called out as they continued their descent. Sarah acknowledged, her eyes constantly scanning between the instruments and the snow-filled sky ahead. The aircraft handled differently now, requiring constant adjustments to maintain their course and altitude. Data for single-engine approach, Sarah requested, and Michael began calculating their landing parameters. Weight, speed, configuration, everything had to be recalculated for their new reality. There would be no room for error. The radio crackled with urgent communications as emergency services positioned themselves along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency response teams were moving into place, preparing for every possibility. Sarah could hear the controlled urgency in the tower controller's voice as they coordinated the emergency response. 10,000 feet, Michael announced. Approach checklist. They began working through the procedures, each item checked and double-checked. The fate of 216 souls depended on their accuracy, their judgment, their skill. Sarah's mind was racing through scenarios, planning for every contingency. What if the right engine failed too? What if the fire suppression hadn't worked? What if the snow intensified further? Each possibility had to be considered, each potential problem anticipated and planned for. Delta 2847, Toronto Tower. The radio came alive with a new voice. Wind 230 at 15, gusting 25. Runway 23 cleared for emergency landing. Emergency equipment in position. The crosswind would add another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. Through the snowfall, they could now see the faint lights of Toronto's skyline. Somewhere below, news crews would be gathering, alerted by the emergency declarations and scanner traffic. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting these people safely on the ground. 8,000 feet, Michael called out. Single-engine approach, speeds calculated. VRF plus 15 for the conditions. Sarah nodded, already thinking ahead to the landing. They would have one chance to get this right. No room for a go-around with only one engine. The aircraft shuddered slightly as they encountered turbulence, a reminder of their vulnerability. But Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls, her mind focused solely on the task ahead. Years of training, thousands of hours of experience, all culminating in these crucial moments. Sarah, Michael's voice was quiet but firm. Fire warning has not extinguished. The implications were clear. Despite shutting down the engine and discharging the fire bottle, something was still burning. Their window of time was closing. Understood, Sarah replied, her decision already made. We continue for immediate landing. Alert cabin crew. Brace positions in 5 minutes. The time for caution was past. Now it was about getting on the ground as quickly as safely possible. The snow seemed to intensify as they descended through 6,000 feet, the weather closing in around them like a shroud. But somewhere ahead, through the swirling white, lay their salvation. Runway 23, its powerful lights penetrating the storm, guiding them home. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, the lives depending on her next decisions. The real test was about to begin. They would need every bit of skill, every ounce of experience, every moment of training to make it through the next few minutes. The approach to runway 23 waited ahead, a challenge that would define their lives forever. In seat 14C, retired Air Force Colonel James Harrison felt the vibration change before anyone else noticed something was wrong. 30 years of flying military aircraft had attuned him to the subtleties of engine behavior, and he knew immediately that this wasn't normal turbulence. He glanced out his window at the left engine, his experienced eyes noting the subtle changes in its operation. 2 rows ahead, Emily Chen clutched her 3-year-old daughter Sophie tighter as the aircraft shuddered. "It's just a little bump," she whispered, more to herself than to her child. But when the engine's pitch changed dramatically and the vibration intensified, she saw the fear she felt reflected in the faces around her. The cabin fell silent in that peculiar way that happens when dozens of people collectively hold their breath. The sound of the failing engine reverberated through the cabin, a grinding metallic screech that made several passengers gasp. Then came Captain Chen's announcement about the engine shutdown, her calm voice doing little to mask the gravity of the situation. Jessica Parker, the chief flight attendant, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her face a mask of professional composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give me your attention," she began, demonstrating the brace position with fluid movements. "We'll be landing in Toronto shortly. When you hear brace, brace, bend forward." In row 23, businessman Mark Thompson found himself gripping the hand of the elderly woman next to him. He couldn't remember when they'd started holding hands, perhaps during the terrible screeching noise, or maybe when the left engine went silent. Her name was Ruth, she'd told him earlier, and she was flying to visit her grandchildren. "I've lived a good long life," Ruth said softly, her grip firm despite her trembling voice. "But I suspect you have children waiting at home." Mark nodded, thinking of his two boys. "Then we'll make sure you get back to them," she added with surprising strength. Colonel Harrison had been watching the flight attendants closely, reading their body language, noting the subtle signs of controlled urgency in their movements. When Jessica passed his row, he caught her eye. "Former pilot," he said quietly. "Let me know if you need any help." She nodded almost imperceptibly, logging his location in her mental map of the cabin. The snow was visible through the windows now, thick flakes swirling past in the darkness. The cabin lights flickered once, briefly, causing a ripple of nervous murmurs. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, its wails cutting through the tense atmosphere. Emily Chen began singing softly to Sophie, an old lullaby her mother had sung to her. The passenger across the aisle, a young man with headphones around his neck, joined in humming the melody. Soon, several others nearby had taken up the tune, the simple act of sharing music becoming a lifeline of comfort. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "are we going to be okay?" Before Emily could answer, a voice came from behind them. "Of course we are, sweetheart." It was an older woman with kind eyes. "I'm a teacher, and I always tell my students that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what we need to do, even when we're scared." In the front of the cabin, a businessman in first class was becoming increasingly agitated, his voice rising as he demanded answers from the flight attendant. Colonel Harrison watched as other passengers stepped in, their words gentle but firm, reminding him that panic wouldn't help anyone. The aircraft banked, beginning its final approach. Jessica's voice came over the intercom. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The professional phrase carried an undercurrent of urgency that every passenger felt. Colonel Harrison noticed the flight attendants exchanging glances, their expressions confirming his suspicion that this was more than a routine precautionary landing. Mark Thompson and Ruth were still holding hands, but now they had been joined by the teenager sitting on Ruth's other side. The boy had been trying to act tough earlier, but fear knew no age limits. Ruth had simply reached over and taken his hand, and no words had been necessary. The cabin lights dimmed, and the tension became almost palpable. Emily Chen pulled Sophie closer, wrapping her coat around both of them. The young man across the aisle had closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. Throughout the cabin, strangers reached for each other, finding strength in human connection. Colonel Harrison kept his eyes on the wing, watching the flaps extend, reading the aircraft's configuration like a book. When he saw the final approach flaps deploy, he knew they were minutes from landing. He caught Jessica's eye again and nodded slightly. Everything looked as it should, given the circumstances. "Brace, brace." The command came suddenly, Jessica's voice strong and clear. The cabin moved as one, passengers assuming the position they had been shown, heads down, hands clasped behind their necks. Emily Chen wrapped herself around Sophie, whispering, "I love you," over and over. The snow was a white blur outside the windows now. Ruth's grip on Mark's hand tightened, and he heard her whispering what sounded like the Lord's Prayer. The teenager on her other side had begun crying silently, and Ruth's other hand squeezed his with maternal comfort. Through the eerie silence of the dead left engine, the sound of the landing gear deploying seemed deafening. Colonel Harrison felt the aircraft's subtle changes in pitch and power, his experience telling him that despite everything, this was a well-controlled approach. In these final moments before touchdown, the cabin was united in a way that transcended the usual boundaries of class, age, and background. 216 souls, bound together by circumstance, each carrying their own fears, their own prayers, their own desperate hopes. The runway lights began to strobe past the windows, growing closer with each second. The snow swirled in the aircraft's wake, creating an otherworldly scene outside the windows. Inside, in the dim light of the cabin, humanity faced uncertainty together, finding strength in unity, courage in connection. The ground rushed up to meet them. "Left engine fire warning still active," Michael announced, his voice tight with tension as they descended through 3,000 feet. Sarah's grip tightened on the controls, feeling every subtle movement of the aircraft as they fought through the deteriorating weather conditions. The single functioning engine strained against the heavy snow, its performance pushed to the limits by the demands of keeping the massive aircraft aloft. The cockpit was alive with warning indicators, a constellation of amber and red lights that painted an increasingly dire picture. Through their headsets came the constant communication from Toronto Tower, updating them on rapidly changing wind conditions and visibility reports. The snow had intensified dramatically, reducing visibility to barely half a mile. "Hydraulic pressure dropping on System 2, Michael called out, adding another critical concern to their growing list of problems. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. They were losing more than just an engine. The fire was potentially compromising other crucial systems. "Toronto Tower, Delta 2847, Sarah transmitted, her voice remaining professional despite the chaos. "Request immediate wind check and RVR." The response came back quickly. Visibility was continuing to deteriorate, and the crosswind had increased to 22 knots, gusting to 30, right at the limits of their single-engine capabilities. The aircraft shuddered as they encountered wind shear, the single working engine screaming as it fought to maintain their flight path. Sarah's hands moved constantly, making tiny adjustments to keep them stable. Every muscle in her body was tensed, her focus absolute as she processed the stream of information coming at her. 2,000 feet, Michael called out. "Localizer alive." The instrument landing system was their lifeline now, guiding them through the swirling snow toward a runway they couldn't yet see. Sarah's eyes darted between the instruments, trusting their guidance while fighting the instincts that screamed at her to pull up, away from the unseen ground below. Another warning light flickered to life. The fire detection system was now showing potential damage to the wing structure. Sarah knew they were running out of time. The aircraft wasn't just dealing with an engine fire anymore. They were facing the possibility of structural failure. "Ground proximity warning system, tested and active," Michael confirmed, his voice steady despite the implications. They would need every system, every backup, every bit of technology to get through the next few minutes. The snow outside had turned the world into a white void, making them entirely dependent on their instruments. The radio crackled again. "Delta 2847, be advised. Previous landing aircraft reported severe wind shear on final approach." Sarah acknowledged the warning, already feeling the turbulent air tossing them around. The single engine configuration made them more vulnerable to these conditions, requiring constant power adjustments to maintain their approach path. 1,000 feet, Michael announced. "Outer marker crossed." They were committed now. With their compromised systems and single engine, a go-around would be extremely risky. This approach had to work. Sarah felt sweat trickling down her back despite the cockpit's cool air. The aircraft systems continued to deteriorate. The hydraulic pressure was now dangerously low, and warning indicators showed the fire had potentially spread to nearby systems. Every second they remained in the air increased the risk of catastrophic failure. 700 feet, Michael called out, glide slope and localizer centered. Sarah's hands were moving constantly, fighting the gusting winds that threatened to push them off course. The engine gauge showed they were running at nearly full power, pushing the limits of what their remaining engine could safely deliver. The radio came alive with urgent traffic. "Delta 2847, multiple fire warnings observed from ground. Rescue equipment in position." Sarah didn't respond. All her focus was on the instruments, on keeping the aircraft stable as they descended through the turbulent air. 500 feet, Michael announced, his voice tight. "Sync rate normal." The aircraft bucked in the wind, requiring every ounce of Sarah's skill to maintain their approach path. Warning indicators continued to multiply across the panel, each one representing another system in distress. Through the swirling snow, the first lights of the runway became visible, ghostly apparitions that appeared and disappeared in the white chaos. Sarah kept her eyes on the instruments, knowing that in these conditions, visual references could be dangerously misleading. 300 feet, Michael called. All landing criteria confirmed. Despite the situation, their crew discipline remained absolute. Each check performed, each procedure followed. Years of training had prepared them for this moment, though none had ever faced quite this combination of challenges. The wind shear alert suddenly blared through the cockpit, a computerized voice warning of dangerous air conditions ahead. Sarah's response was immediate, increasing power to the remaining engine, feeling it strain against its limits as they fought through the turbulent air. 200 feet, Michael announced, his voice barely audible over the various alarms and warnings now filling the cockpit. The aircraft was shuddering constantly, buffeted by winds and struggling with its compromised systems. The runway lights were clearer now, but the snow continued to swirl around them, creating a disorienting strobe effect. Sarah's world had narrowed to the essential instruments: airspeed, altitude, vertical speed. Everything else faded into background noise as she focused on the critical task of keeping the aircraft stable on its final approach. The lives of everyone aboard hung on these final moments, on her ability to guide them safely through this maze of complications. 100 feet, Michael called out. Landing clearance confirmed. The ground proximity warning system began its automated callouts, counting down their height above the runway. Sarah could feel the aircraft wanting to roll toward the dead engine, requiring constant correction to keep their wings level. The runway threshold lights loomed ahead through the snow, their intensity barely visible through the white curtain. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, her mind clear despite the chaos around her. Everything in her career had led to this moment. They were about to find out if it would be enough. The Emergency Response Center at Toronto Pearson International Airport erupted into action the moment Delta 2847 declared an emergency. Chief Emergency Coordinator Marcus Thompson slammed his coffee mug down, immediately activating the airport's highest level of emergency response as the first reports of engine fire came through. All units, this is command. We have a Category 4 emergency in progress. Delta aircraft on approach with confirmed engine fire. 200+ souls on board. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. His voice echoed through the emergency frequencies, setting in motion a carefully choreographed but rarely used emergency protocol. Fire trucks were already rolling out of their stations, their red lights cutting through the heavy snow. Veteran Fire Chief Sandra O'Malley was in the lead truck, her mind racing through scenarios as her team donned their gear. 23 years of service, and engine fires were still the ones that kept her up at night. Command, Rescue 1, Sandra's voice crackled over the radio. Positioning along runway 23. Visibility severely limited, requesting additional foam units. The snow was falling heavier now, reducing visibility to near zero conditions, but they would be ready, whether they could see the aircraft or not. In the air traffic control tower, Controller David Chen had cleared all other traffic from the approach path. His hands moved across the radar screen, directing other aircraft into holding patterns, his voice maintaining its professional calm as he coordinated with neighboring control centers to manage the ripple effects of the emergency. All units be advised, Marcus's voice came through again. Aircraft reporting multiple system failures, possible structural compromise. The words sent a chill through everyone listening. This wasn't just an engine fire anymore. This was potentially much worse. Emergency Medical Services Coordinator Dr. Rachel Martinez was mobilizing every available ambulance in the Greater Toronto area. I want 3 trauma teams on standby, she ordered into her phone, while simultaneously coordinating with nearby hospitals. And get me that passenger manifest. I need to know about any special medical needs on board. The snow was coming down so hard now that the emergency vehicle's powerful lights created an eerie dome of illumination around the runway. Fire crews checked their equipment one final time, each person knowing their role, each movement practiced countless times in drills, but now weighted with real consequence. Command tower, David's voice cut through the radio traffic. Aircraft 5 minutes from touchdown. All emergency vehicles confirm positions. One by one, the units radioed in their readiness. They were as prepared as they could be, but in these weather conditions, with this combination of problems, everyone knew they were facing a worst-case scenario. Sandra positioned her truck near the runway's midpoint, where statistics showed most aircraft emergencies ended up. Through the swirling snow, she could barely see the runway lights. How the hell is she going to land in this? She muttered, knowing the pilot was facing conditions that would be challenging even with both engines working. The airport's Emergency Coordination Center was now fully staffed, with representatives from every relevant agency present. Airline officials huddled over documents, while airport operations staff coordinated the shutdown of all other runway operations. Every screen showed radar images, weather data, or emergency vehicle positions. 3 minutes to touchdown, David announced from the tower. Wind 230 at 25, gusting 35. The crosswind was now well beyond normal limits, adding another layer of complexity to an already dire situation. Sandra watched her truck's anemometer spinning wildly, the wind whipping snow into near whiteout conditions. Marcus was on the phone with city officials, coordinating the broader emergency response. "Yes, Mayor, we're fully mobilized." "No, we can't delay for better weather. That aircraft is coming in now, one way or another." His free hand moved across a digital map, confirming the positioning of every emergency asset. Dr. Martinez's voice came over the radio. "All medical units in position. Trauma teams standing by at Sunnybrook and St. Michael's." The medical response vehicles were staged just far enough from the runway to be safe, their crews watching the sky, waiting for any sign of the approaching aircraft. 2 minutes, David called out. The tension in his voice was barely noticeable, but it was there. In the tower, he could see the strobing lights of all the emergency vehicles through the snow, their red beacons creating a surreal scene below. Sandra keyed her radio. "All fire units, charge your lines. Be ready for immediate response." She heard the pumps engaging on the trucks around her, felt the vibration as her own truck's massive water cannon came to life. They had enough foam to drown an aircraft twice this size, but first they had to be able to reach it. 1 minute to touchdown, David announced. Aircraft on final approach. The emergency frequency fell silent as everyone held their breath, straining to hear the sound of engines through the howling wind and swirling snow. Marcus stood in the emergency center, his eyes fixed on the radar screen showing Delta 2847's final approach. 25 years of emergency response experience, and he'd never seen this combination of circumstances. Engine fire, system failures, severe weather, full passenger load. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. 30 seconds, David's voice was almost a whisper. In the fire trucks, crews tensed, ready to move. In the ambulances, medical teams checked their equipment one final time. Police units secured the perimeter, ensuring no one could get close enough to be in danger. Through the snow, they began to hear it, the strange, asymmetrical sound of an aircraft operating on a single engine. Sandra gripped her radio tighter, her other hand on the door handle, ready to move the moment they were needed. "Aircraft in sight," David called from the tower, though few on the ground could see anything through the snow. The emergency vehicle's lights created a ghostly tunnel of illumination along the runway, a guide path through the storm for an aircraft they couldn't yet see. The next few seconds would determine whether this would be a rescue or a recovery operation. 216 lives hung in the balance, descending through the snow toward their waiting emergency crews. The sound of the aircraft grew louder. 50 feet, Michael called out, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Sarah's hands were locked on the controls, every fiber of her being focused on keeping the crippled aircraft stable as they descended through the swirling snow. The single working engine screamed in protest as she fought against the gusting crosswind. Through the white haze, the runway lights appeared and disappeared like desperate signals from another world. The aircraft shuddered violently as another wind shear hit them, forcing Sarah to make split-second power adjustments with their remaining engine. There was no room for error now, no possibility of a go-around with their systems failing and the fire warning still blaring. 40 feet, Michael announced, sink rate normal. But nothing about this approach was normal. The aircraft wanted to roll toward the dead engine, requiring constant correction. Sarah could feel the controls becoming sluggish as the hydraulic pressure continued to drop. Every movement had to be anticipated, every adjustment made with perfect precision. First Officer Rivera's voice maintained its professional calm as he continued the call-outs. 30 feet, 20 feet. Each number brought them closer to either salvation or disaster. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles now, their lights creating a surreal red glow through the snow. They looked like tiny toys from up here, but their presence was a comfort, a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. The wind shifted suddenly, violently, trying to push them off the center line. Sarah's response was immediate, instinctive, developed through thousands of hours in the cockpit. The working engine roared as she commanded more power, fighting to keep them aligned with the runway. Her feet danced on the rudder pedals, compensating for the dead engine's lack of thrust. 10 feet, Michael called. The runway threshold passed beneath them, a blur of lights through the storm. Sarah began the flare maneuver, gently easing the nose up, bleeding off their speed. But the crosswind had other ideas, forcing her to make constant corrections. The aircraft lurched to the left, the dead engine's weight becoming more pronounced as their airspeed decreased. Time seemed to slow down in these final moments. Sarah could hear every sound, the howl of the wind, the strain of the remaining engine, the creak of the aircraft's structure as it fought against the elements. Her world had narrowed to this single task, getting these people safely on the ground. 5 feet, came Michael's voice, seeming to echo from somewhere far away. The snow swirled around them in crazy patterns, creating disorienting visual illusions. But Sarah didn't trust her eyes anymore. She was flying by feel now, by the thousands of landings stored in her muscle memory, by the subtle vibrations coming through the controls. The left wing dipped again, more aggressively this time. Sarah countered with right aileron, but the response was sluggish. The hydraulic pressure was critically low now, making the controls feel like they were moving through molasses. She could hear the strain in the aircraft's structure, feel it fighting against her commands. 3 feet. Michael's call-out was interrupted by a sudden violent gust that tried to flip them over. Sarah's response was instantaneous, her hands and feet moving in perfect coordination, forcing the aircraft to obey her will. The remaining engine's power surged as she demanded everything it had left to give. The ground effect cushion of air beneath them became turbulent, disrupted by the crosswind. The aircraft bucked like a living thing, trying to break free of Sarah's control, but her grip remained firm, her corrections precise, her focus absolute. 216 lives depended on these final seconds. Time compressed to a singular moment. Sarah could feel everything. The weight of the aircraft, the asymmetric thrust, the dying hydraulic system, the violent air currents trying to tear them apart. Her mind processed it all, making hundreds of tiny adjustments, fighting to keep them level, to keep them alive. The runway lights strobed past them now, creating a hypnotic pattern through the snow. The aircraft's shadow appeared and disappeared beneath them, cast by the emergency vehicle's powerful lights. They were committed now, past the point of any other option. Whatever happened next would happen here, on this runway, in these next few seconds. Sarah felt, rather than saw, the right main gear touch down. A slight chirp, a subtle vibration. She held the left wing up, fighting against gravity and aerodynamics, keeping the dead engine's side in the air for a crucial moment longer. The aircraft's weight settled onto the right gear, the tires squealing against the snow-covered runway. The left main gear touched down a second later, and Sarah's world exploded into a symphony of mechanical sounds. The roar of thrust reversers, the screech of brakes, the rumble of wheels on pavement. The aircraft shuddered as she commanded maximum braking, feeling the anti-skid system pulse through the pedals. They were still moving too fast, the snow making the runway treacherously slick. Sarah maintained perfect centerline, knowing that any deviation now could be catastrophic. The sound of the thrust reverser on their single working engine created an eerie asymmetric howl as it helped to slow their momentum. Emergency vehicles were moving alongside them now, keeping pace as they decelerated through the storm. Sarah couldn't spare them a glance. All her attention was focused on keeping the aircraft straight, bleeding off speed, fighting the crosswind that still tried to push them off the runway. Finally, incredibly, their speed dropped below 50 knots, then 30, then 20. The aircraft's movements became more sluggish, more predictable, as aerodynamic forces gave way to simple physics. Sarah felt the last of their momentum wash away as they slowed to taxi speed. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. They had made it. The moment Delta 2847's wheels touched the snow-covered runway, Fire Chief Sandra O'Malley's voice cut through the emergency frequencies. "All units, move! Aircraft is down, flames visible on left engine." Through the swirling snow, the massive emergency response sprung into action like a well-orchestrated ballet. The aircraft was still moving at high speed down the runway, a trail of smoke and steam billowing behind it. The fire crews accelerated alongside, their powerful lights illuminating the aircraft's damaged left side. The engine fire had spread, creating an orange glow that pulsed menacingly through the falling snow. "Left side priority," Sandra commanded, positioning her truck to attack the burning engine. "Teams 2 and 3, foam coverage now." The massive foam cannons roared to life, their white streams arcing through the air, coating the burning engine and surrounding structure in fire-suppressing chemicals. Inside the aircraft, Sarah Chen's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. "Cabin crew, prepare for evacuation." The words triggered an immediate response from the flight attendants, who began positioning themselves near the emergency exits, their training taking over despite the chaos around them. The aircraft continued its deceleration, fighting against the slick runway conditions. Emergency vehicles kept pace on both sides, their crews watching for any sign that the fire was spreading. The snow actually helped, turning to steam as it hit the burning engine, adding another layer of fire suppression. "Command, Rescue 1, Sandra reported. "Initial foam application effective, but fire still burning within engine housing." She could see structural damage around the engine mount, the metal warped and discolored from the intense heat. The situation was far from over. The aircraft finally came to a stop near the runway's midpoint, immediately surrounded by emergency vehicles. Their lights created a surreal dome of illumination in the snowstorm, casting multiple shadows that danced across the white ground. The remaining engines spooled down with a dying whine, leaving only the crackle of flames and the hiss of foam. "Evacuation, evacuation, evacuation," Sarah's voice commanded over the intercom. Flight attendants threw their emergency exits open, and the inflatable slides deployed into the snowy night. The bitter cold rushed into the cabin as Jessica Parker's voice rang out. "Leave everything, jump and slide, move quickly but don't push." Dr. Martinez's medical teams moved into position, ready to receive passengers. The snow was falling so heavily now that the evacuation slides looked like ghostly tongues extending from the aircraft's sides. The first passengers appeared in the doorways, illuminated by the emergency lighting. Come on," the flight attendants urged, helping passengers move quickly but safely onto the slides. The snow made the evacuation more treacherous, but also helped slow the slides to a safer speed. Emergency responders waited at the bottom of each slide, helping passengers to their feet, directing them toward the warm buses waiting nearby. Colonel Harrison helped where he could, assisting an elderly couple, then lifting a small child into her mother's arms before they went down the slide together. The professional calm he'd maintained during the flight never wavered as he helped organize the evacuation of his section. Emily Chen clutched Sophie tightly as they approached their exit. The flight attendant helped position them correctly, and then they were sliding into the snowy night, the cold air shocking their systems. Strong hands caught them at the bottom, hurrying them toward safety as more passengers descended behind them. Mark Thompson and Ruth went down separate slides, but found each other in the crowd moving toward the buses. The teenager who had held Ruth's hand during the landing was with them, the three strangers now bonded by their shared experience. They huddled together against the cold, watching the continuing evacuation. Sandra's fire crews maintained their foam coverage, preventing the fire from regaining intensity. The snow was helping, but also creating challenges, making it difficult to see if the fire was spreading to other areas of the aircraft. "All crews be advised," she called out. "Check for hot spots under the wing. Don't assume the snow is containing everything." The evacuation continued with remarkable efficiency, passengers helping each other, flight attendants maintaining order, emergency responders working quickly but carefully in the difficult conditions. The snow swirled around them all, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere despite the urgency of the situation. Sarah Chen and Michael Rivera remained in the cockpit, shutting down systems, securing the aircraft, and communicating with emergency services. Only when the last passenger had been evacuated did they finally leave their posts, making one final check of the cabin before exiting themselves. As Sarah descended the evacuation slide, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The snow was falling on her face, melting and mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Michael landed beside her, and they shared a look that contained volumes: relief, exhaustion, pride, and the knowledge that they had just lived through something extraordinary. "All souls accounted for," came the report over the emergency frequencies. 216 passengers and crew evacuated safely. In the emergency command center, Marcus Thompson closed his eyes briefly, saying a silent thank you. Then he was back in action, coordinating the next phases of the response. The aircraft stood silent now, its left side coated in foam, steam rising where hot metal met snow. Emergency vehicles maintained their positions, their lights still cutting through the storm. Fire crews continued their work, methodically checking every potential danger spot, taking no chances. In the warm buses, passengers hugged each other, cried, laughed, and tried to process what they had just lived through. Strangers who had faced death together were now bonded by an experience they would never forget. Flight attendants moved through the buses, checking on everyone, their professional demeanor finally starting to crack with emotion. And through it all, the snow continued to fall, covering the runway in fresh white, as if trying to erase the evidence of the drama that had just unfolded. But for those who had been part of it, the memory would remain forever clear. The night they defied the odds and made it home. The emergency triage area in Terminal 1 had been transformed into a sea of shock blankets and concerned faces. Dr. Rachel Martinez moved efficiently between patients, her experienced eyes assessing each person quickly but thoroughly. Most of the injuries were minor, some bruises from the evacuation slides, a few cases of mild hypothermia from the snow, and the inevitable effects of stress and anxiety. "Just breathe slowly," she instructed an elderly man whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. His wife sat beside him, clutching his arm, both of them still wrapped in the silver emergency blankets. "You're safe now. Your body just needs time to process what happened." Around them, other medical professionals repeated similar reassurances to shell-shocked passengers. Emily Chen sat with Sophie curled in her lap, both of them sipping hot chocolate provided by airport staff. The 3-year-old had been remarkably calm throughout the entire ordeal, and now she was finally drifting off to sleep, exhausted by the evening's events. A paramedic checked them once more, noting their vital signs as stable. Mark Thompson and Ruth had refused to be separated, the unlikely friendship forged in crisis growing stronger in its aftermath. The teenager who had held Ruth's hand during landing, they now knew his name was Jason, sat with them, all three sharing their stories with a crisis counselor who listened with practiced empathy. Colonel Harrison had become an unofficial liaison between the passengers and airline staff, his military background and calm demeanor making him a natural leader in the chaos. He moved through the terminal, checking on fellow passengers, relaying information, helping maintain order in what could have easily become a panicked situation. In a quiet corner, Jessica Parker and her flight crew were giving their initial statements to transportation safety investigators. Their voices were professional but strained, the adrenaline crash beginning to hit as they recounted the events of the past hour. Their training had held, their procedures had worked, but the emotional toll was starting to show. Outside, in the still falling snow, investigators were already examining the aircraft. Their powerful lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the damage to the left engine and surrounding wing structure. Fire crews remained on standby, their foam trucks positioned strategically, taking no chances despite the fire being extinguished. Sarah Chen and Michael Rivera sat in separate rooms, giving their detailed accounts to investigators. The technical debriefing would take hours, every decision analyzed, every action scrutinized. But for now, the focus was on capturing their immediate recollections while they were still fresh. The first indication was a slight vibration, Sarah explained, her hands moving as if still on the controls. Different from normal turbulence. Then the temperature reading on the left engine began to fluctuate. Her voice remained steady as she reconstructed the events, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion setting in. In the terminal's operations center, Marcus Thompson coordinated with airline representatives to arrange accommodations for the passengers. Some would be rebooked on morning flights, others would need hotels, and all would require continued support and care. The logistics were daunting, but compared to what they'd just survived, it was a welcome challenge. News crews had gathered outside the terminal, their satellite trucks creating a media village in the parking lot. The story was already breaking across national networks. The miraculous landing, the successful evacuation, the professional crew who had saved 216 lives. But inside, away from the cameras, the human story was still unfolding. A young mother wept quietly as she spoke to her husband on the phone, the reality of what might have happened finally hitting her. Nearby, a businessman who had complained about missing his connection now sat in silence, perspective thoroughly adjusted by the evening's events. A flight attendant took a moment alone in a corner, her hands trembling as she sipped water. Dr. Martinez continued her rounds, now checking on the crew. The physical demands of the evacuation, combined with the psychological stress, had left them running on empty. "You need rest," she insisted, noting their vital signs and the signs of exhaustion. "The debriefings can wait." The snow had finally begun to ease, revealing the massive emergency response still active on the airfield. Floodlights illuminated the runway where Delta 2847 stood, its left side scarred and blackened, but its structure intact, a testament to engineering and human skill that had brought it safely to Earth. In the terminal, passengers began to form lasting bonds. Phone numbers were exchanged, social media connections made. They had shared something profound, something that would link them forever. Even those who had been strangers hours before now spoke like old friends, their shared experience creating an instant community. Ruth had finally convinced Mark and Jason to contact their families, watching with grandmotherly satisfaction as they made their emotional phone calls. "Life is precious," she told a passing crisis counselor. "Sometimes it takes something like this to remind us." Colonel Harrison finally allowed himself to be checked by medical staff, though he insisted he was fine. The doctor examining him noticed his hands were scratched from helping others down the evacuation slides, but he waved off any concern. "Others needed help more than I did," he said simply. As midnight approached, the terminal slowly transformed again. Cots were brought in for those who would be staying the night. Food was arranged, care packages distributed. The immediate crisis had passed, but the ripple effects would continue for days, weeks, even years to come. Sarah Chen stood at a window, watching the continuing activity around her aircraft. Michael joined her silently, both of them lost in their own thoughts. No words were necessary between them. They had faced death together and won, sharing a bond that few could understand. And outside, in the clearing sky, fresh snow continued to fall on Delta 2847, its white blanket slowly covering the scars of a night that none of them would ever forget. 2 days after the emergency landing, Captain Sarah Chen sat quietly in Delta's Toronto operations office, still processing the events that had thrust her into the international spotlight. The headlines called her a hero, the angel of Flight 2847. But she knew the successful outcome had been the result of countless people doing their jobs exactly as they should. "The Today Show wants an interview," Michael Rivera mentioned, scanning through the mountain of media requests that had accumulated. "So does Good Morning America, CNN, BBC. He trailed off, noting Sarah's discomfort with the attention. Like her, he believed they had simply done what they were trained to do. The preliminary investigation reports were already painting a clear picture of just how close they had come to disaster. The engine fire had indeed spread to the wing structure, and the hydraulic systems had been mere minutes from complete failure. The fact that they had landed safely was being hailed as a masterpiece of aviation skill. In the hospital, most passengers had been treated and released, with only a handful requiring overnight observation for minor injuries. The real healing, though, was happening in less visible ways. Support groups had spontaneously formed among the passengers, connecting through social media to share their experiences and recovery journeys. Emily Chen and Sophie had become minor celebrities after their story went viral, the mother who had kept her daughter calm by singing through the crisis. Morning shows were particularly interested in their story, but Emily had declined most interviews, preferring to focus on helping Sophie process the experience through play therapy and drawing. Mark Thompson, Ruth, and Jason had maintained their unexpected friendship. They met for coffee 2 days after the landing, sharing their different perspectives on the experience. Ruth, with her lifetime of wisdom, helped the younger men understand that their fears and ongoing anxiety were normal, even healthy responses to what they had survived. Colonel Harrison had emerged as a spokesperson for the passengers, his military background and natural leadership abilities making him the perfect bridge between the airline and those who had been on board. He deflected praise for his own actions during the evacuation, instead focusing attention on the crew's professionalism and the passengers' mutual support. Jessica Parker and her cabin crew were being honored by the airline for their exceptional performance under pressure. The investigation had revealed that their precise execution of emergency procedures had been crucial in achieving the rapid evacuation, particularly given the hazardous weather conditions. The maintenance investigation had uncovered a previously unknown defect in the engine design, leading to immediate inspections of similar aircraft worldwide. Sarah found some comfort in this. At least their experience would help prevent similar incidents in the future. In the airport's emergency response center, Marcus Thompson was overseeing the creation of new protocols based on lessons learned from the incident. The successful response had highlighted some areas for improvement, particularly in coordinating multiple agencies during severe weather conditions. Fire Chief Sandra O'Malley had submitted her detailed report, emphasizing the crucial role that rapid foam application had played in preventing the engine fire from spreading further. Her recommendations for new foam dispersal techniques in snow conditions were already being adopted by other airports. Dr. Rachel Martinez's medical response team was being studied as a model for mass casualty incident management, even though, thankfully, there had been no serious injuries. Their efficient triage system and emphasis on psychological support had proven invaluable in the aftermath. Delta's corporate headquarters had announced significant safety investments, using Flight 2847 as an example of why continuous improvement in aviation safety was essential. Sarah had been asked to consult on new training protocols, her experience offering unique insights into managing multiple system failures. The aviation community had embraced the incident as a teaching moment. Flight schools were already incorporating lessons from the landing into their training programs, using the cockpit voice recorder transcripts to demonstrate exemplary crew resource management under extreme pressure. Sarah found herself thinking often of the passengers, not as a group, but as individuals. The elderly couple who had thanked her with tears in their eyes. The young business traveler who had given her a handwritten note expressing his gratitude. The child who had drawn a picture of her as a superhero. Michael had thrown himself into analyzing the technical aspects of their experience, working with investigators to create detailed simulations that would help train future pilots. It was his way of processing the event, turning a near tragedy into a learning opportunity for others. The airline industry's response had been swift and comprehensive. New maintenance procedures were being implemented, emergency response protocols were being updated, and crew training programs were being enhanced. Flight 2847 was becoming a case study in both what could go wrong and how to respond when it did. Late one evening, as Sarah prepared to finally fly home, she stopped to look at Delta 2847, now moved to a maintenance hangar. The damaged engine had been removed, the wing repairs were underway, and soon the aircraft would return to service, carrying passengers who might never know its history. A maintenance worker approached her, hesitating before speaking. "My daughter was on your flight," he said simply. "Thank you." Sarah nodded, unable to find words. These moments kept happening, brief connections with people whose lives had intersected with hers during those crucial minutes. As she walked away, Sarah reflected on how a single hour could change so many lives. The professional commendations and media attention would fade, but the bonds formed in crisis, the lessons learned, and the lives touched would remain. The snow had long since melted, but its memory remained. A white curtain through which 216 souls had emerged, forever changed by their shared experience. For Sarah Chen, it was a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come during what begins as just another routine flight. 1 month after Flight 2847's emergency landing, the aviation industry was experiencing a transformation. In a brightly lit conference room at Delta's headquarters, engineers, safety experts, and airline executives gathered around a detailed analysis of the incident that had become a catalyst for change. The engine failure analysis has revealed a critical stress point we hadn't previously identified. Dr. James Morrison, Delta's chief safety engineer, explained as he pointed to a complex diagram. What Captain Chen experienced wasn't just a random malfunction, it was a design weakness that could have affected hundreds of aircraft. The investigation had sparked a worldwide review of similar engine configurations. Maintenance crews across the globe were conducting detailed inspections, armed with new protocols developed directly from the lessons of Flight 2847. Already, several potential issues had been caught and addressed before they could develop into emergencies. In Toronto, the airport's emergency response procedures were being rewritten. Fire Chief Sandra O'Malley had developed new techniques for foam application in severe weather conditions, her innovations drawing attention from airports worldwide. The snow complicated everything that night, she explained to a group of international fire chiefs. We had to adapt our standard procedures in real time. The flight crew's actions had led to significant changes in simulator training. Sarah Chen had been asked to consult on new emergency scenarios, incorporating the unique combination of challenges she had faced. It's not just about the engine failure, she emphasized during a training session. It's about managing multiple cascading systems failures while dealing with severe weather conditions. Dr. Rachel Martinez's medical response team had revolutionized their approach to mass casualty preparation. Even though we didn't have serious injuries, we learned valuable lessons about managing large groups of people in crisis, she explained to her staff. The psychological impact is just as important as physical trauma. The airline industry's communication protocols were being overhauled. The clear, calm exchanges between Sarah Chen and air traffic control during the emergency had become a model for crisis communication. Controllers worldwide were now training with recordings from that night, learning how precise, efficient communication could make the difference between disaster and survival. Technology companies had taken notice too. New software was being developed to better predict potential engine failures, using data patterns identified from Flight 2847's black box recordings. The warning signs were there, a software engineer explained. We just needed to learn how to read them better. The passenger experience was also changing. Airlines were revising their safety briefings, making them more engaging and memorable. Studies had shown that the calm, professional behavior of Flight 2847's passengers during evacuation had been partly due to their attention to the pre-flight safety demonstration. In the maintenance hangars, new inspection protocols were becoming standard. The subtle vibration that Sarah had first noticed was now part of regular engine checks. Maintenance crews had developed more sensitive testing procedures, looking for early warning signs that might have been overlooked before. Weather prediction systems were being upgraded too. The severe snow conditions that had complicated the emergency landing had led to improvements in runway condition reporting and real-time weather updates. Airports were investing in more sophisticated snow removal equipment and de-icing systems. The human factor hadn't been forgotten either. Airlines were enhancing their crew resource management training, using Flight 2847 as a case study in effective teamwork under pressure. The coordination between Sarah Chen and Michael Rivera had become a textbook example of cockpit collaboration. Emergency evacuation procedures were being refined based on the experience. The challenges of evacuating in heavy snow had led to new guidelines for slide angles and passenger assistance in severe weather conditions. Flight attendant training now included more specific scenarios for weather-complicated evacuations. The ripple effects reached beyond aviation. Other industries were studying the incident for lessons in crisis management and emergency response. Nuclear power plants, chemical facilities, and other high-risk operations were incorporating insights from Flight 2847 into their safety procedures. In the realm of public safety, the coordination between different emergency response teams during the crisis had led to improved protocols for multi-agency responses. The seamless cooperation between fire crews, medical teams, and airport personnel had become a model for emergency management. Research institutions were conducting detailed studies of the incident. Universities were developing new engineering courses based on the engine failure analysis. Psychology departments were studying the passenger response patterns for insights into human behavior during crises. The aviation insurance industry had taken notice too. The successful outcome of Flight 2847 had led to new risk assessment models and safety incentive programs. Airlines that implemented the new safety protocols could qualify for reduced premiums. But perhaps the most significant changes were the invisible ones, the subtle shifts in attitude and awareness throughout the industry. Every pilot who stepped into a cockpit thought about Sarah Chen's experience. Every maintenance check was performed with a little more attention to detail. Every emergency drill was taken a little more seriously. In a quiet moment between training sessions, Sarah reflected on these changes. The near disaster had become a gift to aviation safety, each lesson learned potentially saving future lives. The technical improvements were important, but it was the heightened awareness, the renewed respect for the complexity of aviation that might prove most valuable. As she watched a new group of pilots file into the simulator room, Sarah knew that her experience would live on through them. Every decision she had made that night, every challenge she had faced, would help prepare others for their own moments of crisis. The legacy of Flight 2847 wasn't just in the new procedures and protocols, it was in the strengthened commitment to safety, the renewed appreciation for training, and the reminder that in aviation, there was no such thing as a routine flight. In hangars and cockpits, in control towers and emergency response centers, the lessons of that snowy night continued to shape the future of aviation safety. The industry had learned, adapted, and emerged stronger, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And somewhere in the sky, another flight crew was running through their pre-flight checks, more thorough than ever before, their dedication to safety shaped by the lessons of Flight 2847. The banquet hall at Toronto's Royal York Hotel buzzed with emotional energy as survivors of Flight 2847 gathered for their one-year reunion. Captain Sarah Chen stood near the entrance, greeting each passenger as they arrived, amazed at how many faces she remembered from that snowy night. Emily Chen and Sophie, now 4, were among the first to arrive. Sophie ran to Sarah, wrapping her arms around the pilot's legs. "Look what I drew," she exclaimed, holding up a crayon picture of an airplane with wings made of hearts. Emily smiled, her eyes meeting Sarah's with understanding. They had all been changed by that night, even the youngest among them. Mark Thompson, Ruth, and Jason arrived together, their unlikely friendship having deepened over the past year. They had met monthly for coffee, processing their experience, supporting each other's recovery. Ruth had become a surrogate grandmother to Jason, who was now studying aviation technology in college, inspired by the events of that night. Colonel Harrison entered with his characteristic military bearing, but his eyes were warm as he greeted his fellow passengers. He had become an advocate for aviation safety over the past year, speaking at conferences about the importance of passenger cooperation during emergencies. His experience had given him a new mission in life. Jessica Parker and her cabin crew arrived as a group, their bond strengthened by their shared experience. They had received commendations for their performance that night, but the real reward was seeing their passengers thriving, healing, moving forward with their lives. Michael Rivera stood beside Sarah, both of them watching the emotional reunions unfold. They had flown together many times since that night, their partnership deepened by their shared experience. Every flight was different now, not haunted by memory, but enriched by a deeper appreciation for their responsibility. Fire Chief Sandra O'Malley joined the gathering, along with Dr. Rachel Martinez and other emergency responders who had been there that night. The passengers greeted them with hugs and tears, finally meeting the people who had been waiting in the snow to help them to safety. As dinner began, Sarah stood to address the room. The chattering quieted as she spoke. "A year ago, we faced something extraordinary together. Some call it a miracle, others call it luck. I call it a testament to human resilience, professional training, and the strength we find in unity." Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. They had all carried the experience differently. Some had needed therapy, others had made major life changes, many had formed lasting friendships, but all had been transformed by those crucial minutes between sky and earth. The evening unfolded with stories shared, memories revisited, and healing reinforced. Emily Chen revealed that she had started taking flying lessons, turning her fear into determination. Mark Thompson had left his high-pressure corporate job to work with a disaster relief organization. Ruth had written a book about resilience in crisis, dedicating it to her flight family. As coffee and dessert were served, a slideshow played on the wall, news coverage, photographs, and messages from the past year. There were images of the snow-covered runway, the damaged aircraft, the emotional reunions in the terminal. But more importantly, there were pictures of recoveries, achievements, and new beginnings. Children who had been on the flight played together near the dessert table, their laughter a reminder that trauma need not define a life. Their parents watched with grateful hearts, knowing how close they had come to a different outcome. Jessica Parker shared that several passengers still kept in touch with her, sending holiday cards and updates about their lives. "We're not just crew and passengers anymore," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're family." The aviation industry had changed too. Sarah and Michael had helped implement new safety protocols, their experience informing improvements that would protect future flights. The lessons of Flight 2847 had rippled through the industry, making air travel safer for everyone. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah found herself by a window, looking out at the snow falling softly over Toronto. So similar to that night, yet somehow different. Michael joined her, both of them reflecting on how far they had come. "Remember what you said in the cockpit?" he asked quietly. "Just before we landed." Sarah nodded. "Keep her steady," she recalled. "Trust your training." "You were right," he smiled. "About all of it." The gathering began to wind down, but no one seemed eager to leave. These people had shared something profound, not just the crisis, but the recovery, the healing, the growth that had followed. They had learned that survival was just the beginning. It was what you did with your second chance that mattered. Colonel Harrison led the group in a toast. To Flight 2847, not for what we endured, but for what we learned about ourselves and each other. To the courage of our crew, the skill of our first responders, and the strength we found together. As the evening ended and goodbyes were shared, plans were already being made for next year's reunion. Phone numbers were exchanged, hugs were given, and promises to keep in touch were renewed. The bonds forged in crisis had evolved into something deeper, a shared understanding of life's fragility and beauty. Sarah watched them leave, each person carrying a piece of that night with them, but also carrying the strength and wisdom it had given them. The snow continued to fall outside, no longer a harbinger of danger, but a reminder of resilience, courage, and the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to rise above crisis. As she left the hotel that night, Sarah Chen looked up at the snowy sky, feeling grateful for second chances and the mysterious ways that crisis could bring out the best in humanity. Somewhere above the clouds, aircraft continued their journeys through the night, their crews and passengers safer because of what Flight 2847 had taught them all. The legacy of that night lived on, not in fear, but in wisdom, not in trauma, but in triumph, not in what was lost, but in what was found when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances together.